Sarah Martinez had always believed that bad things happened to other people. At 28, she lived in a comfortable suburban home with her husband David and their twin daughters, Emma and Lily, who had just turned 6. Her biggest worry was usually whether she remembered to pack lunch money or if the girls had clean soccer uniforms for practice. That ordinary Tuesday morning started like any other. Sarah dropped the twins at school, kissed David goodbye as he left for his construction job, and settled into her home office to work on graphic designs for local businesses. The California sun streamed through her window, and she hummed softly while sketching a new logo for a bakery downtown. The first sign of trouble came as a distant orange glow on the horizon around noon. Sarah barely glanced up from her computer screen. Wildfires were common in their area during dry seasons, but they always seemed to stay safely in the mountains, far from their quiet neighborhood of Maplewood Heights. The local news had mentioned some brush fires earlier that week, but nothing that seemed threatening to residential areas. By 2 o'clock, the smell of smoke had grown stronger. Sarah stepped onto her back porch and noticed ash falling like gray snow onto her garden furniture. Her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, was watering her roses with unusual intensity, glancing nervously toward the hills. The elderly woman had lived in the neighborhood for 40 years and had weathered several fire seasons. "Sarah, dear," Mrs. Chen called over the fence, her voice tight with worry. "I think we should start paying closer attention to the news. The smoke is getting thicker." Sarah nodded and hurried back inside to check her phone. The local emergency services had issued a fire watch advisory, but nothing more serious. Still, something in the air felt different today. The wind had picked up, carrying with it an acrid smell that made her eyes water slightly. She tried calling David, but his phone went straight to voicemail. Construction sites often had poor cell reception. At 3:15, Sarah's phone buzzed with an emergency alert. Her heart skipped as she read the words, "Evacuation warning issued for Maplewood Heights and surrounding areas. Residents should prepare to leave immediately if conditions worsen." The reality hit her like a cold wave. She wasn't just reading about a distant fire anymore. This was real, and it was coming toward them. Sarah ran to the window and saw her neighbors across the street, loading suitcases into their car with quick, jerky movements. The Hendersons had 2 small children, and she could see Mrs. Henderson crying as she strapped car seats into their minivan. Sarah's hands trembled as she grabbed her laptop and started making a mental list of what to pack. Family photos, important documents, medications, clothes for the girls. But where should she start? Everything seemed equally important and completely meaningless at the same time. Her wedding dress hanging in the closet, the handmade quilts from her grandmother, the girls' artwork covering the refrigerator door. She called the school district's emergency line, which was busy. Then she tried calling David again, pacing around her living room as the phone rang endlessly. Outside, the sky had taken on an eerie yellowish tinge, and the wind was rattling her windows with increasing force. Finally, David's voice crackled through the phone. "Sarah, I've been trying to call you. We're being sent home from the job site. The fire jumped the highway about 10 miles from here." "David, they issued an evacuation warning for our neighborhood," Sarah said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "I'm going to get the girls from school." "No, wait," David said quickly. "I'm closer to the school than you are right now. I'll pick them up. You start packing essential items. Documents, photos, medicines, just the things we absolutely cannot replace." After hanging up, Sarah stood in her living room for a moment, overwhelmed by the surreal nature of the situation. This morning she had been worried about a client deadline. Now she was deciding which memories were worth saving from a potential fire. She had seen news stories about wildfires destroying entire neighborhoods, but she had never imagined the impossible weight of choosing what parts of your life to abandon. She pulled out 3 large suitcases and began moving through the house methodically. Birth certificates, passports, and insurance papers went into a fireproof document bag. Photo albums and her external hard drive with years of family pictures followed. The girls' favorite stuffed animals because she knew they would be devastated without them. A few changes of clothes for each family member. As Sarah worked, she became aware of a growing roar in the distance, like a freight train that never passed. The sound made her stomach clench with primitive fear. She had heard that wildfires made that kind of noise when they were large enough, consuming everything in their path with an appetite that seemed almost alive. When David arrived with Emma and Lily, both girls were unusually quiet. Their school had explained the situation in age-appropriate terms, but Sarah could see the confusion and fear in their wide eyes. They had never experienced anything like this before. "Mommy, are we going on a trip?" Emma asked, noticing the packed suitcases by the door. Sarah knelt down and pulled both girls close. "We might need to stay somewhere else for a few days just to be safe. Remember how we sometimes have fire drills at school? This is like that, but for our whole neighborhood." David was loading the car when the second emergency alert came through. This time the message was shorter and more urgent. "Evacuation order now in effect for Maplewood Heights. Leave immediately. Use designated evacuation routes only." Sarah felt her chest tighten as the weight of those words sank in. This was no longer a warning or a precaution. They were being ordered to leave their home, possibly forever. The next hour unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. Sarah strapped Emma and Lily into their car seats while David made one final sweep of the house, grabbing their emergency cash stash and the girls' iPads to keep them distracted during what might be a long journey to nowhere. As they backed out of their driveway, Sarah turned for one last look at their home. The 2-story house with blue shutters and a wraparound porch had been their sanctuary for 8 years. They had painted every room, planted the oak tree in the front yard, and built countless memories within those walls. Now it sat there looking peaceful and normal, as if completely unaware of the danger racing toward it. The evacuation route was chaos. What normally would have been a 10-minute drive to the main highway stretched into an hour of stop-and-go traffic. Cars packed with belongings, pets, and frightened families created a slow-moving river of refugees fleeing the approaching flames. Sarah watched elderly neighbors she recognized from the grocery store sitting in their cars, looking lost and overwhelmed. Children pressed their faces to windows, some crying, others treating it like an adventure. Behind them, the sky had turned an ominous dark orange, and thick smoke columns rose like massive tornadoes. The fire was moving faster than anyone had predicted. David kept the radio on, and the emergency updates grew more urgent with each broadcast. Roads were closing. The fire had jumped containment lines. Evacuation centers were filling up quickly. "Where are we going, Daddy?" Lily asked from her car seat, clutching her stuffed elephant. "We're going to stay with Uncle Mike and Aunt Jennifer for a while," David answered, trying to keep his voice light. His brother lived 2 hours away in a direction that should be safe from the fire's path. Emma, always the more perceptive twin, stared out the back window. "Why is the sky that color? It looks scary." Sarah reached back and squeezed her daughter's hand. "Sometimes the sky changes colors when there's smoke in the air. It's like when we have fog, but different." Traffic came to a complete stop on the highway on-ramp. David drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, clearly fighting his own anxiety. Through the windshield, Sarah could see that several cars ahead had overheated in the gridlock. People were getting out to check their engines, and she could hear shouting and car horns honking in frustration. A police officer on a motorcycle weaved between the stopped vehicles, stopping at random cars to give updates and directions. When he reached their window, David rolled it down quickly. "Officer, how bad is it back there?" David asked, nodding toward their neighborhood. The officer's face was grim behind his sunglasses streaked with ash. "Sir, I'm not going to lie to you. The fire has reached the residential areas. We've got crews working to save as many structures as possible, but this wind is making it nearly impossible to contain." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Their house might already be gone. All of their possessions, their memories, their security, reduced to ash while they sat trapped in traffic on a highway ramp. "The important thing is that you and your family are safe," the officer continued, noticing Sarah's expression. "We can rebuild houses. We can't replace people." After the officer moved on, the family sat in heavy silence. The twins had fallen asleep despite the noise and commotion, exhausted by the stress and confusion of the day. Sarah watched other families around them dealing with the same devastating uncertainty. An older man in the car next to them was crying openly while his wife rubbed his shoulders. Behind them, a young couple was arguing in tense whispers over a road map. When traffic finally began moving again, Sarah called David's brother to let him know they were coming. Mike's voice was full of concern and immediate offers of help. "You stay as long as you need," he said without hesitation. "Jennifer is already making up beds for the girls, and we've cleared out the guest room for you two." As they drove through the night toward safety, Sarah kept checking the news updates on her phone. The Maplewood Heights fire had consumed over 3,000 acres and was still growing. Evacuation orders had expanded to include several more neighborhoods. The cause was still under investigation, but officials suspected a downed power line had sparked the initial blaze during the high winds. The girls woke up when they finally reached Mike and Jennifer's house around midnight. Both twins were confused and cranky, asking why they couldn't go home to their own beds. Sarah and David exchanged a look over their daughters' heads, neither wanting to explain that home might not exist anymore. Jennifer, David's sister-in-law, had prepared everything they could need: fresh towels, toothbrushes, snacks for the girls, and a pot of coffee for the adults. Her kindness was overwhelming, but Sarah felt numb to everything around her. She kept thinking about their house, wondering if the fire had reached their street yet. "I saved some news coverage on the DVR if you want to see what's happening," Mike offered quietly, but Sarah shook her head immediately. "Maybe tomorrow," she said. "I don't think I can handle watching it burn on television tonight." After getting the girls settled in the guest room, Sarah and David lay awake in the fold-out couch, listening to the distant sound of sirens on the highway. Evacuees were still streaming out of the fire zone, and emergency vehicles continued racing toward the flames. "Do you think our house is still there?" Sarah whispered in the darkness. David was quiet for a long moment. "I honestly don't know," he admitted. "But whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." Sarah closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind wouldn't stop racing. She thought about all the little things she hadn't packed: the girls' baby teeth in the jewelry box upstairs, her mother's recipe cards handwritten in faded blue ink, the anniversary gift David had given her last month, still sitting unopened on her dresser because she had been saving it for a special occasion. Outside, the horizon still glowed orange with distant flames, and Sarah realized that their old life had ended the moment they drove away from Maplewood Heights. Whatever came next would be built from the ashes of everything they had known. Sarah woke to the smell of pancakes and the sound of her daughters giggling in the kitchen. For a split second, she forgot where they were and why. Then reality crashed back down on her like a physical weight. They were refugees in her brother-in-law's house, and she had no idea if they still had a home to return to. David was already awake, sitting at the edge of the fold-out couch with his phone pressed to his ear. He was speaking in low, urgent tones to someone from his construction company, trying to find out if any of his crew members had been affected by the fire. When he hung up, his expression was troubled. "3 of my guys live in the evacuation zone," he told Sarah quietly. "Rodriguez lost his apartment complex. The whole building is gone." Sarah felt a stab of guilt for focusing on her own problems when so many others were suffering too. She had been thinking about their house and their belongings, but she hadn't considered that David's employees and friends were facing the same devastating losses. Jennifer appeared in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "The girls are eating breakfast," she said gently. "I thought you might want to check the news coverage before they come back." Sarah's stomach clenched, but she knew she needed to see what had happened. David turned on the television, and they huddled together on the couch as the morning news showed aerial footage of the fire zone. The destruction was breathtaking and horrible. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to ash and twisted metal. Swimming pools sat empty and cracked in the middle of burned lots where houses had stood just days before. When the news showed footage of Maplewood Heights, Sarah grabbed David's hand so tightly her knuckles went white. Their street appeared on the screen for just a few seconds, but it was enough. The reporter was standing in front of what had been the Hendersons' house, but all that remained were the concrete steps leading to nowhere and a blackened chimney rising from a pile of debris. "That's our street," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The camera panned across the devastation, showing house after house reduced to ash. Sarah tried to identify landmarks, but everything looked the same now. Skeletal remains of trees, twisted car frames, and piles of rubble where families had built their lives. Then she saw it. In the background of the reporter's broadcast, she could make out the distinctive stone mailbox that had belonged to their next-door neighbors. And beyond that, impossibly, was the corner of what looked like their blue shutters, still partially intact. "David, look," she said, pointing at the screen. "Is that our house?" David squinted at the television, trying to make sense of the grainy footage. I think part of it might still be standing." The news report moved on to other areas, leaving Sarah with more questions than answers. Had their house survived? Was it damaged beyond repair? Were their belongings still inside, or had everything been destroyed? Emma and Lily bounded into the living room. chocolate chips from Jennifer's pancakes smeared across their faces. They seemed to have adapted to their new surroundings with the resilience that only children possess, treating their stay at Uncle Mike's house like an extended sleepover. "Mommy, can we go home today?" Emma asked, climbing onto Sarah's lap. "I want to show Lily my new drawings, but they're in my room." Sarah's throat tightened. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that home might not exist anymore? That her drawings, her toys, her entire world might have been consumed by flames while she slept safely in another house? "We need to wait a little bit longer, sweetie," Sarah said carefully. "There's still some danger in our neighborhood, so the police aren't letting people go back yet." "But what about Mr. Whiskers?" Lily asked, referring to their cat. "Is he scared without us?" Sarah's heart lurched. In all the chaos of packing and evacuating, she had completely forgotten about their cat. Mr. Whiskers was an indoor cat who rarely ventured outside, but in their panic to leave, they hadn't been able to find him. She had assumed he was hiding somewhere in the house and would be fine until they returned. Now she realized that if their house had burned, Mr. Whiskers might have been trapped inside. The thought made her physically sick. David must have seen the horror on her face because he quickly stood up. "Girls, why don't you go help Aunt Jennifer in the kitchen?" "I think she's making cookies." When the twins had scampered away, Sarah broke down completely. All the fear and stress and uncertainty of the past 2 days crashed over her at once. She sobbed into David's shoulder, mourning their cat, their house, their sense of security, and the innocence her daughters had lost when they learned that terrible things could happen without warning. "We don't know anything for sure yet," David said, stroking her hair. "Mr. Whiskers is smart. He might have gotten out when he smelled the smoke. And you saw that footage? Part of our house might still be there." Sarah wanted to believe him, but she had seen enough of the news coverage to understand how complete the destruction was in some areas. Even if their house had partially survived the flames, it could be damaged by smoke, water from firefighting efforts, or looting in the aftermath. Mike came home from work that afternoon with news. As a local police officer, he had contacts in the fire department and emergency services. He sat down with Sarah and David in the living room, his expression serious but hopeful. "I talked to Captain Rodriguez this morning," Mike said. "They're going to start letting residents back into some areas tomorrow, but only for brief escorted visits to assess damage and retrieve essential items. You have to register at the emergency center and wait for your turn." Sarah felt a surge of desperate hope mixed with terror. She wanted to see what remained of their home, but she was also afraid of what they might find. Sometimes not knowing was easier than facing a devastating reality. "What should we expect?" David asked. Mike hesitated. The fire was unpredictable. Some houses on a street might be completely destroyed while others barely have scorch marks. It jumped around based on wind patterns, vegetation, and building materials. You really won't know until you see it for yourselves. That night, Sarah lay awake making lists in her head of what to look for if they were allowed back into their house. Important papers they might have missed, family heirlooms that might have survived, signs of what had happened to Mr. Whiskers. But mostly, she tried to prepare herself mentally for the possibility that everything they had built together might be gone forever. The emergency center looked like a disaster movie set. Hundreds of evacuees filled a converted gymnasium, sitting in folding chairs and sleeping on cots provided by the Red Cross. Children ran between the rows while their parents waited in long lines to register for property assessments, file insurance claims, or simply find out if their home still existed. Sarah and David had left the twins with Jennifer, not wanting to expose them to the desperation and heartbreak that filled every corner of the makeshift shelter. They joined the line of residents waiting to sign up for escorted returns to the fire zone, moving slowly forward as each family gave their address and received a time slot for their visit. The woman in front of them was crying softly while clutching a photo of a small yellow house. When she reached the registration desk, Sarah overheard the volunteer gently explaining that her entire street had been consumed by the fire. Nothing remained to visit. When their turn came, Sarah felt her heart hammering as she gave their address to the Red Cross volunteer. The middle-aged man consulted a thick binder full of street maps marked with colored zones. "Martinez family, 1247 Oak Ridge Drive," he said, running his finger down a list. "You're in the yellow zone. That means partial damage to the area, but individual property assessments are needed. You're scheduled for tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Report to Checkpoint 3 on Maple Avenue. Yellow zone." Sarah didn't know if that was good news or bad news. but at least it wasn't the red zone like the crying woman in front of them. They spent the rest of the day at the evacuation center, helping other families and trying to process the stories they heard. An elderly man named Frank had lost his workshop and 40 years' worth of handmade furniture projects. A young mother named Lisa was frantically searching for her 2 cats who had run away during the evacuation. A teenager showed them photos on his phone of his bedroom, now a pile of ash where his guitar collection and baseball trophies had been. Everyone had a story about something precious that couldn't be replaced. Frank talked about the rocking chair he had built for his late wife. Lisa described her cat's favorite hiding spots and asked everyone if they had seen 2 orange tabbies. The teenager kept staring at the photo of his destroyed room, shaking his head in disbelief. Sarah realized that grief came in layers when everything was lost at once. There was grief for the big things like houses and security, but also for the small things that made life meaningful. The coffee mug you drank from every morning, the quilt your grandmother made, the tree you planted when your children were babies. That night, Sarah barely slept. She kept imagining different scenarios for what they might find at their house. In some dreams, everything was perfectly intact, as if the fire had mysteriously passed them by. In nightmares, she walked through rooms filled with ash where she couldn't recognize anything that had once been their belongings. The next afternoon, they drove to Checkpoint 3 in David's truck, following the evacuation route in reverse. The landscape was apocalyptic. Telephone poles stood like blackened matchsticks against the gray sky. The remains of cars sat melted on driveways. Trees that had provided shade for decades were reduced to charred stumps. As they got closer to their neighborhood, the damage became more random and confusing. One house would be completely destroyed while the house next door appeared untouched. A swimming pool might be filled with ash and debris while the garden around it still bloomed with flowers. The fire marshal who escorted them through the checkpoint was a weathered man named Captain Stevens who had been fighting wildfires for over 20 years. He explained that they would have exactly 30 minutes to assess their property and remove any essential items they could carry. "I need to warn you," Captain Stevens said as they walked toward Oak Ridge Drive. "Even if your structure survived, there's likely to be smoke damage, water damage from firefighting efforts, and contamination from ash and chemicals. Don't touch anything with your bare hands and don't spend time looking for sentimental items. Focus on documents, medications, and anything critical for your immediate needs." Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears as they rounded the corner onto their street. The first thing she noticed was that the Hendersons' house was completely gone, just as she had seen on the news. A pile of debris marked where their children had played in the front yard just days ago. Mrs. Chen's house next door was partially standing but clearly damaged. The roof had collapsed on one side and the walls were blackened with smoke stains. Mrs. Chen herself was standing in what used to be her garden, poking through the ash with a stick, probably looking for anything salvageable from her beloved roses. And then Sarah saw their house. The structure was still standing, but it looked wounded. The front porch was intact, but the blue shutters were warped and discolored. Several windows were broken, probably from the heat, and black stains streaked up the exterior walls from the smoke. The oak tree in their front yard was completely gone, leaving only a charred stump where the twins used to hang their swing. "It's still there," David said quietly. Almost in disbelief, Captain Stevens unlocked the front door, which had swelled from water damage and stuck in the frame. When it finally opened, the smell hit them immediately. Smoke, chemicals, and something else Sarah couldn't identify that made her eyes water instantly. The interior was like walking into a different house. Everything was covered in a fine layer of ash and soot. Their furniture was still in place, but it looked gray and lifeless. The family photos on the mantel were covered in grime, their faces barely visible through the residue. Sarah ran upstairs to the girls' room, hoping to find some of their favorite toys to bring back. The stuffed animals on their beds were damp and reeked of smoke, but she grabbed them anyway, knowing Emma and Lily would want them despite the smell. In her own bedroom, she found their jewelry box melted and warped on the dresser. The anniversary gift David had given her was water-damaged but intact. She opened it with trembling fingers and found a necklace with a pendant that read, "Forever and always." Somehow, those words seemed more meaningful now than they had before the fire. David was in the garage, which had suffered the least damage. He was gathering tools and looking for anything else they could use immediately. The cars would have been safer in here, he said, but Sarah could hear the regret in his voice. They had parked both vehicles in the driveway during the evacuation, thinking they would need them to escape quickly. "David," Sarah called from the kitchen. "Look." She was standing by the back door, which was slightly open. On the porch was a small food bowl that definitely hadn't been there when they left. Next to it were tiny paw prints in the ash. "Mr. Whiskers," David said, hope creeping into his voice. They called the cat's name softly, not wanting to scare him if he was hiding nearby. After a few minutes, they heard a faint meowing coming from under the back deck. Sarah knelt down and peered into the shadows. Two yellow eyes stared back at her from the darkness. "Come here, baby," she whispered, extending her hand. "It's okay. We're here." Mr. Whiskers emerged slowly, clearly traumatized but alive. His orange fur was singed and dirty, but he seemed uninjured. He must have escaped through a door or window during the fire and found shelter under the deck, surviving on rainwater and whatever food he could find. Sarah scooped him up carefully, tears streaming down her face. In that moment, holding their scared but living cat, she realized that Captain Stevens and the police officer had been right. Houses could be rebuilt and belongings could be replaced, but the things that really mattered, her family, her husband, even their pet, had all survived. Their 30 minutes were almost up, but Sarah felt something shift inside her as they loaded their salvaged items into David's truck. Yes, they had lost their home and most of their possessions. Yes, rebuilding would be difficult and expensive and emotionally exhausting, but they were all alive and they were all together. That was the foundation they would build everything else upon. The insurance adjuster arrived at their damaged house 3 days later, a professional woman named Carol, who had been assessing fire damage for 15 years. She walked through the structure with Sarah and David, taking photos and notes while explaining what could be salvaged and what would need complete replacement. "The good news is that your house is structurally sound," Carol said, checking the foundation and support beams. "The fire never actually reached the building itself. What you're dealing with is primarily smoke and heat damage, plus water damage from the firefighting efforts." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and overwhelming dread. Relief that their house could potentially be saved, but dread at the scope of work that would be required to make it livable again. Every surface would need to be cleaned or replaced. The entire HVAC system was contaminated with smoke and would have to be rebuilt. Most of their furniture and belongings were ruined by soot and chemical residue. "What's the timeline for something like this?" David asked, ever practical. Carol consulted her tablet and showed them examples of similar restoration projects. "With the extent of smoke damage you have, plus the need to replace flooring, drywall, and most fixtures, we're looking at 4 to 6 months minimum. That's assuming contractors are available, which might be challenging given how many properties were affected by this fire." The twins were growing restless, living out of suitcases at Uncle Mike's house. Emma had started having nightmares about fires, waking up crying and asking if their house was really safe now. Lily had become unusually clingy, refusing to let Sarah out of her sight even to go to the grocery store alone. Sarah realized that their daughters needed stability and routine more than they needed to return to their original house. After several difficult conversations, she and David made the decision to look for a rental property where they could live during the restoration process. Finding a rental in their area proved nearly impossible. Dozens of other fire victims were competing for the same limited housing options, and landlords were raising rents because they knew displaced families were desperate. Sarah spent hours on the phone every day, calling about apartments and houses that were inevitably already rented by the time she could schedule a viewing. Finally, David's construction connections paid off. One of his subcontractors knew about a small house that was becoming available in the next town over. It was older and smaller than what they were used to, but it was clean, safe, and affordable. Most importantly, it was in a good school district where the twins could start classes and begin to rebuild their sense of normal life. Moving into the rental house felt strange and temporary, but also hopeful. Sarah unpacked their salvaged belongings and tried to create a sense of home with the few familiar items they had rescued. The girls' smoky stuffed animals went into the washing machine multiple times until they smelled normal again. David's tools found a place in the small garage. Mr. Whiskers cautiously explored his new territory, still jumping at sudden noises but gradually relaxing. The restoration of their original house began in October, 3 weeks after the fire. Sarah visited the work site every few days to check on progress and make decisions about materials and colors. It was emotionally exhausting to see her home stripped down to its skeleton and rebuilt piece by piece. Sometimes she would stand in what used to be their living room, now just exposed studs and concrete floors, and try to remember how it had looked before. The cozy reading corner where she used to drink coffee in the mornings. The spot on the kitchen wall where they had measured the girls' height every year on their birthday. The bathroom where she and David had given the twins their first bubble baths as toddlers. All of those memories were still real, but the physical spaces where they had happened were gone. Sarah found herself grieving not just for her possessions, but for the sense of continuity that had been broken. Their house had been more than just a building. It had been the repository of their family's history. David threw himself into overseeing the restoration work, spending long hours at the site coordinating with contractors and making sure everything was being done properly. Sarah suspected that staying busy helped him avoid processing his own feelings about what they had lost. One afternoon in November, Sarah was at the house taking photos of the progress when she noticed Mrs. Chen working in the lot next door. Their elderly neighbor was clearing debris from where her house had stood, methodically sorting through the ash and rubble. "Mrs. Chen," Sarah called out, walking over to the property line. "How are you doing?" The older woman looked up, her face streaked with soot and tears. "I'm looking for my mother's china," she said. "It was in the dining room cabinet. I keep thinking maybe some pieces survived." Sarah spent the next hour helping Mrs. Chen sift through the debris. They found several pieces of broken china, badly damaged but recognizable. Mrs. Chen handled each fragment like it was precious, wrapping them carefully in newspaper. "My mother brought this set from China when she immigrated in 1962, Mrs. Chen explained. "She used it for every special occasion. I was planning to pass it down to my granddaughter." Sarah understood that Mrs. Chen wasn't really looking for broken dishes. She was looking for a connection to her history, proof that the life she had built hadn't been completely erased by the fire. Maybe a restoration expert could help piece some of it back together, Sarah suggested gently. Mrs. Chen smiled for the first time that day. "Maybe so. Thank you for helping me look. It makes me feel less alone." As Sarah drove back to their rental house that evening, she thought about the different ways people were coping with their losses. Some, like David, stayed busy with practical tasks. Others, like Mrs. Chen, focused on trying to recover specific, meaningful items. Sarah realized she had been doing something different altogether. She had been trying to rebuild not just their house, but their entire sense of identity as a family. That night, she sat down with Emma and Lily and showed them the photos she had taken of their house renovation. The twins were fascinated by the construction process, asking dozens of questions about how walls were built and where their bedrooms would be. "Will it look exactly the same as before?" Emma asked. Sarah considered her answer carefully. "It will look similar but also different. We get to choose new colors and new furniture. It's like we get to build our dream house but in the same place where our old house was." "Can my room be purple this time?" Lily asked hopefully. "If that's what you want, then yes," Sarah replied. "This is our chance to make everything exactly the way we want it." For the first time since the fire, Sarah felt genuinely excited about the future instead of just anxious about getting through each day. By December, the restoration was progressing faster than expected. The new drywall was up, the floors were being refinished, and Sarah was spending more time at the house making decisions about paint colors and fixtures. The twins had started asking when they could move back home, and Sarah was beginning to believe they might actually be ready by spring. Then David got hurt. It happened on a Tuesday morning while he was working at a commercial job site across town. A scaffold collapsed and David fell 15 feet onto concrete. Sarah got the call from his foreman while she was reviewing tile samples for their bathroom renovation. "Mrs. Martinez, this is Tom from Apex Construction. Your husband has been in an accident. He's conscious and talking, but we're taking him to County General Hospital right away." Sarah's hands shook so badly she could barely drive to the hospital. The twins were at school, giving her a few hours to figure out how serious David's injuries were before she had to decide what to tell them. David was in the emergency room with a concussion, 3 broken ribs and a badly sprained ankle. The doctor explained that he was lucky. The fall could have been much worse. He would need to stay in the hospital for observation for 2 days, then several weeks of recovery at home. No heavy lifting, no construction work, and definitely no climbing ladders, the doctor said firmly. This is a serious wake-up call, Mr. Martinez. Your body needs time to heal properly. Sarah sat beside David's hospital bed, holding his hand and trying not to cry. They had survived a wildfire and were rebuilding their entire life. Now this setback felt like more than she could handle. David was the primary breadwinner, and his construction work required physical strength he wouldn't have for weeks or possibly months. What are we going to do about the house? David asked groggily, clearly worried about the same things Sarah was thinking. We'll figure it out, Sarah said, though she had no idea how. Right now you need to focus on getting better. The twins took David's injury better than Sarah had expected. They drew get-well cards and helped bring him meals in bed during his recovery. But Sarah could see the stress building in their 6-year-old faces. Too many big, scary changes had happened in too short a time. Emma started having trouble sleeping again, and Lily became perfectionist about keeping her belongings organized, as if controlling her toys and clothes could somehow control everything else that felt chaotic in their lives. The financial pressure was immediate and crushing. David's company provided some disability pay, but it was much less than his normal salary. The insurance payments for the house restoration were structured in phases, tied to completion milestones. With David unable to supervise the work properly, progress slowed significantly. Sarah took on more graphic design clients, working late into the night after the girls went to bed. But freelance income was unpredictable, and she was exhausted from trying to manage the house renovation, David's recovery, and the girls' emotional needs all at the same time. 3 weeks after David's accident, Sarah was reviewing the construction budget when she realized they were going to run out of money before the house was finished. The restoration costs had exceeded the original estimates, partly because of additional damage discovered during the work, and partly because of delays that increased labor costs. She sat at their small kitchen table in the rental house, surrounded by bills and estimates and insurance paperwork, feeling more overwhelmed than she had even during the fire itself. At least during the evacuation, she had known what needed to be done. Now she felt like she was drowning in decisions and responsibilities she wasn't equipped to handle. David found her there at midnight, crying over a calculator and a stack of invoices. "Sarah, what's wrong?" he asked, moving carefully because of his still healing ribs. "We can't afford to finish the house," she said without looking up. "We're going to have to stop the renovation and sell it as is, probably at a huge loss." David sat down across from her and started going through the numbers. Sarah watched his face grow more troubled as he realized she was right. Even if he went back to work immediately, which the doctor had forbidden, they didn't have enough money to complete the restoration. "Maybe we could get a loan," David suggested. "I already tried. Banks don't want to lend money on a fire-damaged property that's still under construction." They sat in silence for several minutes, both trying to think of solutions that didn't seem to exist. "What if we didn't finish everything at once?" David finally said. "What if we moved back in when the basic systems are done and finished the cosmetic work ourselves over time?" Sarah looked at the construction timeline again. The plumbing, electrical, and HVAC work would be completed in another month. The house would be livable even if it didn't have new paint and flooring in every room. The girls would have to live in a construction zone, Sarah pointed out. "Kids are resilient," David said, "and it might actually be fun for them to help pick out paint colors and see the progress happening day by day." Sarah felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. It wasn't the perfect solution she had been hoping for, but it was a workable solution. They could move back home and finish the restoration gradually, as money allowed. The next morning, Sarah called their contractor and explained the new plan. He was understanding and willing to work with them to prioritize the essential repairs. Within a week, they had a revised timeline that would allow them to move back in by February. When Sarah told the twins about the new plan, their reaction surprised her. "We get to help paint the walls?" Emma asked excitedly. "And we can watch them install our new ceiling fan," Lily added. Sarah had been worried about bringing her daughters back to a house that was still being repaired, but she realized that the girls might actually find it empowering to participate in rebuilding their home. Instead of being victims of circumstances beyond their control, they could be part of the solution. That night, as Sarah tucked the twins into bed in their temporary home for what might be one of the last times, Emma asked a question that made Sarah's heart ache. Mommy, when we move back to our real house, will everything be okay again? Sarah sat on the edge of Emma's bed and chose her words carefully. I think we're going to be okay, but maybe in a different way than before. We've learned that we're stronger than we thought we were, and we've learned that the most important part of our home isn't the walls or the furniture. It's us being together. Emma considered this seriously. So even if our house looks different, it will still be our home because we're all there? Exactly, Sarah said, kissing her daughter's forehead. Home is wherever our family is together. As Sarah turned off the lights and headed to her own room, she realized that Emma had understood something that Sarah was still learning. The fire had taken their house, but it hadn't taken their home. Home was something they carried with them, and something they could rebuild anywhere. Moving back into their house in February felt like stepping into a time machine that had malfunctioned. The rooms were familiar but transformed, with new drywall that smelled like fresh paint and hardwood floors that gleamed under temporary work lights. Plastic sheeting covered doorways where trim work was still being finished, and boxes of fixtures waited in the hallway to be installed. The twins treated it like the world's best adventure playground. They helped Sarah choose between 3 shades of yellow for the kitchen walls and assisted David with simple tasks like sorting screws and holding measuring tapes. Emma declared herself the official paint stirrer, while Lily appointed herself inspector of all electrical outlets. This one works, Lily would announce solemnly after testing each new switch, as if the house's functionality depended entirely on her approval. Sarah found herself falling in love with their home all over again, but in a deeper way than before. When they had first bought the house 8 years ago, she had loved its potential and its possibilities. Now she loved its resilience and its scars. The slight discoloration on one wall where the smoke damage hadn't quite covered completely. The new beam in the living room that was slightly different from the original wood. The rebuilt kitchen that was laid out more efficiently than the old one had been. David's recovery progressed slowly but steadily. He couldn't do heavy construction work yet, but he could supervise and plan and make decisions. More importantly, Sarah noticed that he was talking more about what he wanted their life to look like going forward, instead of just focusing on getting back to exactly what they had before. I've been thinking about starting my own construction company, he told Sarah one evening as they sat on their front porch, watching the girls play in the yard where their old oak tree had stood. Rodriguez wants to partner with me. We could specialize in fire restoration and rebuilding. There's going to be a lot of demand for that kind of work. Sarah looked at her husband, seeing a new kind of determination in his eyes. The accident had scared him, but it had also given him perspective about what kind of work he wanted to be doing and why. It would be risky, she said, but not as a discouragement. She was thinking through the practical implications, the way they had learned to do when facing big decisions together. Everything's risky, David replied, but at least this would be our risk, building something that could help other families go through what we went through. By April, most of the major restoration work was complete. They still had projects to finish. The guest bathroom needed new tile, and Emma's room was waiting for the purple paint she had requested, but the house felt like home again. Mr. Whiskers had reclaimed his favorite sunny spot by the living room window, and the girls had established new routines and favorite places throughout the rebuilt spaces. One Saturday morning, Sarah was working in the garden when she noticed Mrs. Chen standing in her empty lot next door. Her elderly neighbor had decided not to rebuild, instead, selling the land to a young couple who planned to construct a modern house. Mrs. Chen was moving to a senior living community closer to her daughter, but she had come back to say goodbye to the place where she had lived for 40 years. I brought you something, Mrs. Chen said, walking over with a small potted plant. This is a cutting from my rose bush. I grew it from one of the pieces we found in the debris. Sarah accepted the plant with tears in her eyes. The rose bush had survived the fire in the form of this small green shoot, ready to bloom again in new soil. Thank you, Sarah said. I'll take good care of it. Roses are tougher than they look, Mrs. Chen replied with a smile. Sometimes they need to be cut back to the roots before they can grow stronger. After Mrs. Chen left, Sarah planted the rose cutting in the spot where their old oak tree had stood. The twins helped her water it and promised to watch for the first buds. It would take time to grow into a proper bush, and even longer to become the kind of established plant that could provide shade and beauty for decades. But it was a beginning. That evening, the family gathered for dinner at their rebuilt kitchen table. The chandelier overhead was new, chosen by Emma because it had crystals that made rainbow patterns on the walls when the sun hit them just right. The cabinets were painted a soft blue that Sarah had fallen in love with at the hardware store. The whole room felt both familiar and fresh, like a favorite song performed by a new artist. "Can we tell the story about the fire tonight?" Lily asked as Sarah served dessert. It had become a family tradition over the past few months. The girls liked to hear the story of their family's big adventure, but told as a story with heroes and challenges and ultimately a happy ending. Sarah had learned to tell it in a way that acknowledged how scary and difficult it had been, while emphasizing their strength and the kindness of people who had helped them. "Once upon a time," Sarah began, "there was a family who thought they knew what home meant. But then there was a big fire." Emma interrupted as she always did. "That's right. And the fire changed everything. But it didn't change the most important things. Like us loving each other," Lily added. "Exactly. And it taught us that home isn't just a building. Home is the people you love and the memories you make together. Even when scary things happen, you can build a new home that's even better than the old one." David reached across the table and squeezed Sarah's hand. In his eyes, she saw the same mixture of gratitude and determination that she felt every day now. They had faced something terrible and survived it. More than survived, they had learned from it and grown stronger because of it. After the girls went to bed, Sarah and David walked through their house, turning off lights and checking that doors were locked. It was a routine they had done thousands of times before the fire, but now it felt different, more intentional, more grateful. As Sarah lay in bed that night listening to the familiar sounds of her family sleeping safely around her, she thought about scars. The house had scars from the fire, places where new materials met old, slight color variations where repairs had been made, systems that worked perfectly but differently than before. Her family had scars too. Emma still sometimes had nightmares about fires. Lily still organized her belongings with unusual care. David moved more carefully because of his accident. Sarah herself startled at unexpected sounds and checked their emergency supplies more often than necessary. But scars, Sarah had learned, were not signs of weakness. They were proof of survival, evidence of healing, markers of growth. Their family's scars told the story of a challenge faced and overcome together. They were reminders of their own resilience and the depth of their love for each other. The house they lived in now was not the same house they had evacuated 10 months ago. It was stronger, more thoughtfully designed, more consciously created, and the family living in it was not the same family either. They had been tested by fire, literally and figuratively, and had emerged with a deeper understanding of what truly mattered. Sarah closed her eyes and felt deeply, completely at peace. Home was not about returning to what had been lost. Home was about moving forward with intention, gratitude, and love. Home was about building something beautiful from whatever materials you had left after the flames died down. Outside, the small rose cutting Mrs. Chen had given her was taking root in the soil where their old oak tree had stood. Soon it would bloom, adding new beauty to a landscape that had been transformed by fire but not destroyed. Like their family, like their home, like their future, it would grow strong and beautiful because of what it had survived, not in spite of it.